I would like to show you a game which Tal called one of the most pleasant games he had ever played. He also said that this game had afforded him the greatest aesthetic pleasure. Indeed, after offering a fantastic queen sacrifice in the middle game, Tal demonstrated his magic in the endgame, creating a pure masterpiece. Smyslov started with c4, the English opening. Tal fianchettos his dark squared bishop. g3, c5, bishop g2, knight c6. Now the common plan for white would be the preparation of the b4 advance, namely a3, rook b1 followed by b4. However, in our game, Smyslov opted for a less common plan, b3 instead, preparing the fianchetto of his bishop. And now, instead of a natural-looking knight f6, which would block the dark squared bishop's diagonal, Tal opted for a more sophisticated development of the knight, e6, in order to develop the knight on e7 and keep the bishop's diagonal open, so that the bishop keeps controlling the d4 square, which will prevent white from playing d4. Bishop b2, knight e7, and it seems that Tal's bishop was so annoying that Smyslov decided to exchange the bishops and played knight a4, which was a dubious decision, because although the bishops will be exchanged, it takes 2 tempi to achieve that. Besides that, after the exchange, the knight is badly placed on b2. Tal castles kingside, e3, d5, knight f3. Now that the knight is on f3 and controls the d4 square, white is ready to play d4, but Tal prevents it. Knight f5. Now both black knights, together with the pawn and potentially the queen, control the d4 square, so white cannot play d4. That's why Smyslov simply castles kingside. Tal's bishop is bad, but he improves it. b6. He's going to fianchetto his bishop, and after the disappearance of the pawn from d5, his bishop will turn into a very strong piece. The knight on b2 isn't really doing anything, so Smyslov plays knight a4, hoping to play d4 later in the game, after which the knight, together with the pawn, will attack the pawn, and also the c5 pawn. And also, after the knight moved away from b2, white can play rook b1, and from b1 the rook will support the advance of the b pawn. Tal fianchettos his bishop, c takes d, e takes d. Now still, white cannot play d4, because after the exchange on d4, black can play queen f6, attacking the pawn for the 3rd time, and it isn't clear how white is going to defend the pawn. That's why Smyslov plays d3 instead, preparing the advance of the pawn further to d4. He's going to play queen d2, followed by rook d1, after which both the rook and the queen, together with the knight of course, will support the advance of the pawn to d4. Tal continues his natural development, queen f6, the queen is greatly placed on f6 on the long diagonal, controlling the d4 square and vacating the d8 square for the rook. Queen d2, rook d8 and rook d1. Now white is ready to play d4, but with his next natural developing move, Tal again prevents it, rook e8. And it turns out that if white plays d4, after the mass exchanges on d4, black will simply win a pawn. Knight takes d4, and white cannot capture because of the simple tactics. As the rook is on e8, rook e1 check would follow. If white captures, the queen falls. If white plays bishop f1, then after the exchange on d4, the rook on a1 would fall. So, as d4 doesn't work, as the rook is on e8, Smyslov played rook b1 in order to prepare another pawn advance, the advance of the b pawn instead. But as the game will show, white will not be able to carry out this pawn advance anyways. That's why it would be better to play rook c1 instead. The rook would be much better placed on c1 than on b1, on the half-open file. But Smyslov hopes to play b4. Rook b1 for this reason. And knight d6, creating a possible threat, namely knight e4, centralizing the knight, attacking the queen, and in case white captures the knight, then black would capture with the pawn, with the discovered attack on the queen, and also the pawn from e4 would attack the knight. That's why Smyslov retreats his knight, knight e1, And also he's going to reroute the knight to c2, and from c2 the knight, together with the rook, will support the advance of the b-pawn. But at the moment, both knights are out of play, and Tal exploits that. In order to increase his initiative, he crosses the center of the board, d4. Both black rooks are ideally placed, very actively placed on the central files. That's why Smyslov wants to keep the files closed and plays e4. But queen e7, unblocking the f-pawn. Tal is going to play f5 in order to open the e-file, because both of his major pieces are already on the e-file. For this reason, Tal recommends in his annotations for white to play f4. And in case black plays f5, as the pawn is on f4, white can play e5, and his pawn is defended. But Smyslov, instead of this, instead of f4, he sticks to his plan, knight c2. But again, that was a dubious decision, because, of course, f5 followed, and now the e-file opens. E takes f. Most probably Smyslov expected Tal to capture on f5, which looks like a natural move. But Tal found a much stronger move. As all white pieces, except the bishop, are placed on the queen side, and the king is almost alone, Tal played knight c5, which leads to the exchange of the bishops. And after the exchange of the bishops, the king will be all alone, the defender of the light squares will disappear, and that means the light squares will be catastrophically weakened, and black can start a very strong attack on the white king. For this reason, white cannot actually capture the pawn, because black would simply capture on g2, white can win one more pawn, but it doesn't change anything. The king, the black king, will be safely placed on h8, and after king takes g2, the catastrophe on the light squares will be inevitable. Queen b7 check. If the king moves to g1, then of course the fork, and white is losing the queen, and the only move would be in this case king f1 instead, but again the queen invades, and after king e2, the king is forced to move to e2, but right under the discovered check. Knight f3 check would follow in this case. The only move is knight e3. The black queen is under attack, but simply queen g2, and white is losing. The queen is under attack, the knight is under attack, and it's pinned, so there is nothing white can do. For the same reason, in this position, after knight e5, white cannot capture on b7 himself, because of queen takes b7, and again the catastrophe on the light squares will take place. That's why, after knight e5, Smyslov plays f4, attacking the knight. But now knight f3 check, with a fork, forcing white to capture the knight, and after bishop takes f3, it turns out that white doesn't have the defender of the light squares anymore. The bishop has disappeared, and the squares are terribly weakened, while black has retained his light squared bishop, and that means the white king is in trouble. And also the rook is under attack. But Smyslov played rook e1, attacking the queen. And we have reached the critical position. Now you can pause the video and try to find Tal's fantastic move. So he invades the second rank, queen e2, sacrificing his queen for the rook. Smyslov captures, and Tal of course captures with the rook. So at the moment Tal has only a rook for the queen, but his rook is dominating on the second file. His bishop is great. His knight will join the attack via f5. His second rook will join the attack. Besides that, that's not over. Black has one more attacking resource, namely the h-pawn. It will move and completely destroy white's pawn structure on the king side. While all white pieces are placed on the queen side, they have terrible coordination, completely disorganized, and cannot take part in the defense of the king. Tal writes in his annotations that he didn't even calculate long variations. He felt that white will not be able to resist this terrible attack. For example, in order to save the queen, the only move is queen c1. But in this case, which Smyslov didn't play, in this case, black will play rook g2 check. The king cannot move to h1, of course, because of checkmate in 1. The king must move to f1 instead. But rook takes h2, threatening rook h1 check, winning the queen. White can play knight e1, attacking the bishop, but the bishop can simply retreat. What now? White pieces are completely paralyzed. The only move that looks like the sensible one is rook b2, in order to exchange the black's terrible rook. But rook h1 check would have followed. And after king f2, the knight joins attack. Knight takes f5, and the knight has a great outpost on e3. So what can white do? For example, white can kick the knight out, but of course the knight would move to e3. By playing g4, also white made a room for his king, because the king is in trouble. There are always checkmating threats. And now the knight is attacking the g4 pawn, so the king must move to g3. But now, of course, h5, creating multiple threats. Black can capture on g4, or the pawn can move to h4. And just to illustrate all the dangers of white's position, I can show you one variation. After g takes h, g takes h, let's say white makes a random move, a3 for example. White doesn't have any good moves anyways in this position. h4 check would have followed, and after king f2, the king is ready to escape, but rook e8, cutting the king on the e-file, the king cannot escape, and a deadly knight g4 checkmate is coming. So Smyslov, in this position, while his queen was under attack, was already in a time trouble. And of course, he wanted to avoid this terrible attack. That's why, instead of saving his queen, he decided to immediately return the queen. Queen takes e2 followed, and bishop takes e2. And now we transpose into the endgame. And Tal will create a masterpiece in this endgame. And he will prove that he isn't just a master of attack. He isn't just a great tactician. He can also play a great endgame. And he will have only a slight advantage. And it will take a great precision and creativity to convert this slight positional advantage. So currently the pawn on d3 is under attack, and white cannot capture on g6 because if this pawn falls, the d4 pawn will turn into a passed pawn and will be unstoppable. That's why white must defend the pawn. Now the pawn is defended, and Tal can capture on f5 either with the pawn or the knight. Tal opted for the former. He captures with the pawn. His pawn is blockading the white pawns, and, which is the most important, as Tal writes in his annotations, he wanted to keep his knight on d6, so that it controls the c4 square. As soon as white plays knight c4, and the knight would be greatly placed on c4, it would be able also to jump on e5, would be greatly placed, centralized on e5, but it won't work. As soon as the knight jumps to c4, black will capture it. So rook e1 followed, attacking the bishop. The bishop retreats to h5, taking under control the e8 square, as the white rook is placed on the only open file, and black rook isn't doing anything. Black, of course, will play rook e8 and exchange the rooks. Smyslov plays knight c4. Of course, the knights are exchanged, b takes c, and rook e8, which leads to the exchange of rooks. And we will transpose into a bishop against a knight endgame, with the pawns on both sides of the board, on the king side and the queen side. And in this kind of positions, with the pawns on the both flanks, bishop is stronger than knight, because the bishop can take part in both the attack and defense. It can support the advance of his own pawns on the both sides of the board, on the king side and queen side, and at the same time it can control and prevent the advance of the enemy pawns. While the knight's scope isn't so large, and it cannot take part in the fight on the both sides of the board. That's why black has an advantage, but it's a slight advantage, and it takes great precision and creativity in order to convert this advantage. So king f2 followed, Tal exchanges the rooks, and here comes the mistake. White had to capture with the knight in order to reroute the knight to the central square, e5. In this case, black would have only a minimal advantage, and Tal writes that most probably Smyslov would find sufficient defensive resources in this case. But instead of capturing with the knight, Smyslov captures with the king, after which his knight will remain passive until the end of the game, as you will see, because Tal will skillfully restrict this knight. So, king f8 followed, king d2, king e7, knight e1, and as Tal has the pawn majority on the queen side, 4 pawns against the 3 pawns, he plays a6, preparing b5. In order to prevent b5, Smyslov plays a4, but now his pawn turns into a target of attack. Most probably Smyslov counted on immediate bishop e8, which Tal didn't play. Indeed, bishop e8 looks like a sensible move, because black is immediately winning a pawn. There is no way white can defend this pawn. But Smyslov prepared a5. Black would be forced to capture, after which his extra pawn would be devalued, because the pawns would be doubled. Besides that, as the bishop would leave the h5 square and wouldn't control the f3 anymore, the knight will come into play and will be centralized. So, instead of this, instead of bishop e8, Tal makes a much stronger move, a5, fixing the pawn on a4. Now, after black attacks the pawn won't be able to move to a5, and in case black captures this pawn, his pawn structure will remain intact, and that would be simply deadly. That's why white must defend the pawn. So Smyslov plays king c2 in order to defend the pawn from b3. And now the bishop leaves h5 for a moment, leaving the f3 square unguarded, so the bishop moves to e8, but white doesn't have time to play knight f3, because the pawn is under attack. White must defend it. And now white is ready to play knight f3, but Tal prevents it. Bishop c6, taking under control the both squares the knight can jump to. So the knight is imprisoned now. So king a3 followed. Now the white can only move back and forth with his king from b3 to a3, king a3, and king f6. Tal's plan is now to invade the king side. It won't be easy, so Tal will carry out a multi-step plan. First, he will move his king to h5, threatening king g4, which will be deadly, of course. If the king invades g4, followed by h3, all these pawns will fall. But as soon as the king reaches h5, white, of course, will play h3 in order to take under control the g4 square and prevent the king from invading. Then the second step of the plan. The pawn would be on h3, so it will be attacked by the bishop in order to provoke the pawn to move further from h3 to h4, after which the g4 square will be weak and the king will invade. So, king b3 followed. That's still the only thing white can do, waiting moves from b3 to a3. King g6, king a3, king h5. The king is ready to invade. That's why h3 is forced. So now the king will return, open the diagonal for the bishop, and the bishop via h5 will move to e2, followed by bishop f1, attacking the pawn, forcing the pawn to move, after which the king will return to h5 and invade g4. That's the plan. King g6, king b3. And now Tal makes a great move. He writes in his annotations that he was really proud of this move during the game. The king must move away to open the diagonal for his bishop, of course. But instead of a natural looking king f6, and the king would be placed closer to the center, Tal plays king g7, and you will see why he did that. White can still, of course, white cannot move the knight. It cannot move to c2, because if white does that, the bishop would invade g2, attacking the pawn, forcing it to move to h4, and the king, of course, will invade. So white can move only the king. King moves to a3, and only now king f6, and king returns to b3. So the idea of this waiting move, first to g7 and then to f6, was to invade the d1 square with check, while the king is on b3 and not on a3. And you will see why it is important. So now that the king is on b3, of course, Tal plays bishop e8. So what to do now? Now we can see the importance of this waiting move. If white, the bishop has left c6, so the knight can, at first sight, can move to f3 and can be centralized, but it doesn't work because of bishop h5. The knight is attacked, it must move to e5, and now bishop d1 comes with check. And in case the king was on a3, bishop d1 would come without check, and white would be able to play knight d7 check with a fork, winning the pawn. And now it comes with check, so the king must move to a3, and black has time to play king e6, taking under control the d7 square, and the knight cannot move to d7 anymore. So the knight can move to c6 in this variation, but now bishop c2 would have followed, and the bishop attacks both pawns, d3 and a4. What to do? Knight e5 seems like the only move to defend the pawn, and white now is in Zugzwang. The knight cannot move because the d3 pawn falls, the king cannot move because the a4 pawn falls. The only moves white has are the pawn moves, and no matter which pawn moves, h or g, the reply will be the same. For example, if g4, okay, now it's black's move, and a strong move h6 would follow. And no matter which pawn moves, for example, if g4, then bishop d1 and complete Zugzwang. White cannot capture on f5 because king takes f5 and the f4 pawn would fall. The h pawn cannot move because the g pawn would fall, and the g pawn cannot advance because that's the idea behind h6. Black would capture on g5, and after f takes g, of course, the knight on e5 would fall. So, of course, that would be losing. That's why, as knight f3 doesn't work, Smyslov plays knight g2 instead. Now, bishop h5. So now Tal is ready to implement his plan, his initial plan, free routing the bishop to f1 and attack the h3 pawn. King c2, taking under control the d1 square in order to prevent possible bishop d1 check. Bishop e2, knight e1, bishop f1, the pawn is under attack, and in case it moves to h4, the g4 square would be weak. But black cannot, it wouldn't be so good to immediately invade the g4 square. In case black hurries and plays king g6 right away, the knight would be activated. Knight f3, king h5, and knight e5. The knight is greatly placed and controls the g4 square, so the king wouldn't be able to invade. That's why after h4, before playing king g6, it's necessary to restrict the knight, and that can be achieved by bishop e2 taking under control the f3 square. The knight cannot move anymore there, and if white plays king d2 in order to kick the bishop out, the bishop moves to h5. Now bishop e8 is coming, after which the pawn would fall, so the king must return to the queen side, and bishop e8, king b3, and bishop c6. Again, restricting the knight, and only after this the king would invade g4 and black is winning. So that's why after bishop f1, white played knight f3 instead of h4. White leaves his pawn under attack and activates his knight. And of course, Tal captures the pawn, but Smyslov immediately returns it with the double attack, attacking the bishop and the pawn. But now the g4 square is weak and the black king will invade. Bishop g2 followed, knight takes h7 check, king g7, knight g5, king g6. Black is ready to invade the g4 square. That's why white must do something. The king cannot stay on the queen side. On the one hand, it must defend the a4 pawn. On the other hand, white must do something against the invasion of the black king on g4. So Smyslov plays king d2, moving his king closer to the king side. Bishop c6, attacking the pawn, and knight king c1 followed. Now, in case Tal hurried and captured on a4, Smyslov prepared knight f3. The bishop would move away from c6 and the f3 square would be unguarded, and the king wouldn't be able to invade anymore because of knight e5, of course, and the knight would control the g4 square, and it isn't clear how black can win that position. That's why Tal made a waiting move instead. Instead of capturing the pawn, he plays bishop g2. The pawn would fall anyways, so there is no need for hurry. King d2 followed, and of course the bishop is controlling the f3 square, the knight cannot be rerouted to e5, so the king can easily invade the g4 square. King h5. What to do now? In case the king g4 is coming, after which the pawn would fall. In case white plays king e2 in order to defend the pawn, after king g4, king f2, the bishop would be under attack, but bishop c6, attacking the pawn, and it might seem that the knight is on time after knight f7, bishop takes a4, knight h6 check, king h5, knight takes f5, bishop d7, attacking the knight, knight d6, a4, knight e4, a3, knight d2. It seems that the knight is on time. If a2, then knight b3, and the knight controls the promotion square, but bishop a4 would follow, and there is no way white can stop the pawn from promoting. That's why after king h5, instead of king e2, Smyslov plays knight e6 instead. King g4, knight c7. So the knight is heading to d5. Bishop c6, attacking the pawn, and knight d5 followed. King takes the pawn, knight e7, with the double attack, attacking the bishop and the pawn. In case black captures the pawn, again, white would capture on f5, and the pawn, black doesn't have any pawns on the king side anymore. And although black would be up 2 pawns, it isn't clear if black can win or not, because the pawns are only on the queen side. The king, the white king, will defend the queen side, and it isn't clear how the white king can take part, can help in the advance of his pawn. So white might try to hold this position. That's why Tal again didn't hurry, he didn't capture on a4. Instead, he made a stronger move, bishop d7, defending his pawn. So again, there is no hurry. The a4 pawn is doomed anyways. Smyslov plays knight d5, attacking the b6 pawn, and only now that the knight isn't attacking the f pawn anymore, Tal captures on a4. Knight takes b6, bishop e8, knight d5, king f3, the knight of course defends f4, but it's only temporary. Knight c7, attacking the bishop, bishop c6, knight e6, again defending the pawn and also attacking the c5 pawn. a4, black is threatening to move further. That's why knight takes c5, a3, knight b3. Now the knight controls the promotion square, but a2, king c1, king takes f4, king b2, king e3, and the pawn will move further, and there is nothing white can do. White tries to create his own passed pawn, but bishop e8, c5. Now you see why the bishop is stronger than the knight. Black can easily stop the c-pawn, while the black pawn is unstoppable. f4, c6, Tal sacrifices his bishop for the pawn, knight takes c6, f3, knight e5, f2. And white can, of course, check and capture on f2, but after a king takes, white king takes, the black king returns, captures on d3, and the d4 pawn promotes to queen. That's why in this position Smyslov resigned. And now I recommend watching another game by Tal in which he sacrificed his queen to start a deadly king hunt. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.